Before we get started, if you find yourself enjoying this story, please consider giving it a like and hit subscribe. As a new and growing channel, every subscription is incredibly impactful. Thanks for supporting our channel and enjoy the story. I work as a police officer on the eastern coast of America. The following is something I need to get off my chest. Here's my story. Both me and my partner Hartman had just bought our freshly microwaved dinners from the local quick stop and were heading back to our patrol vehicle when we got the dispatch. All posts and patrols be advised we received a call from one Charles Fredrickson. All closest patrols will respond. Now, as an officer, you get to know your desk sergeant's voice. Bland and dull usually meant a nuisance call, whereas fast-paced and coupled with a sporadic series of words meant an urgency. Her voice that night, well, it was unfamiliar from what I was used to. She sounded confused and stayed vague. "Time to put our game faces on?" I heard a voice perk up next to me. That enthusiastic tone could only belong to Hartman, my partner. Both him and I were fairly new to this police thing. To give us credit, we've been on the force for a little over a year, though sadly time doesn't change whether or not you're fresh blood. Only experience can. I glanced over at him before jogging over to our vehicle and shouting, "Yeah, I think that address is out in the swamps. Go ahead and pull up a map and tell me where to drive." Hartman wiggled one of his hands into his uniform pocket, balancing his food in his other, before pulling out his phone. I hopped into our vehicle and waited for him. He clambered into his seat, phone in one hand and food half in his other and half spilling onto the floor. "Got it up," Hartman said, showing me his phone screen. This place, whatever it was out in the swamps. God only knew where we were heading. I turned our vehicle in drive and headed off, keying the radio. "This is Police 4. We're 26 minutes away. Are there any closer patrols?" There was a brief silence before she replied, "Negative. All other patrols are conducting training at the station." Bullshit. If there's any cops out there who read this, you know if you hear that other patrols are doing training at 10 p.m. at night, and you're the newest patrol, what they really mean is, all the other patrols are taking a break at the station and can't be bothered to respond to any non-emergencies. Those pricks left us to dry on this one. I swallowed my annoyance and responded, "I copy. What's the emergency?" Once again, another pause. "Have your partner call the desk." Her tone seemed off again. Whatever this was had weirded her out. After Hartman was done shoving his food in the back seat, he made the call. "She's saying she got a call from someone named Charles Fredrickson. He seemed erratic and fidgety. He said he wanted the government to come back and talk to him. She's got no idea what that meant, just for us to be careful and keep in touch." As I headed away from our suburbia and into the boonies, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night air seemed unnaturally heavy and boggy. I'll grant the fact we were heading closer to the swamps as an explanation, but sometimes, you know when things aren't right. A few minutes down the forested and empty road, Hartman spoke up. "At the next fork in the road, take a right." The way that would take us led straight into the woods. Swamp and marshland engulfed the land out there. Even the trees had somewhat submerged into the bile that made up the wetlands. Any hope for a walkway, bikeway, or boatway was non-existent this far down. The only bridge from us to our destination was the unkept and dirty old road that we found ourselves on. My eyes took a venture out the window to verify my thoughts, and they, of course, confirmed that nothing but pitch-colored darkness lay outside our doors. Our headlights were the only sign of life in that abyss of blackness that had surrounded us. I tried to shake off the creep that started forming down my spine and shifted my focus onto driving. Then Hartman spoke up. "Hey, Morgan, you think it's a bit weird that there's no lights up ahead? We're going to a residence, right?" I bit the inside of my cheek, a bad habit that I could never break. I could only answer him with a shrug. Our journey continued in silence until the distant sound of thunder echoed through the void around us. All I could think of was how the sound of nature was better than the soundless emptiness we had found ourselves in. "It says we'll be reaching the end of the road in about a minute," Hartman chimed. He was pressed against his window, squinting his eyes trying to see our destination approaching. I joined him in his search and reduced my speed. I prayed I wouldn't launch myself off the road right into the murky water next to us. It was because of that thought that I slowed down drastically. Thankfully so. I almost didn't see the house crop up right in front of us. No, actually house isn't the right word. It was a manor. A large stone mansion surrounded by swamplands and out in the middle of nowhere. "What the hell is this place?" Hartman asked next to me, arching his head upwards trying to judge the mansion's size. The first few specks of rain began to hit our windshield. "I don't know. I never knew a place like this existed out here," I mumbled while gazing at the stone structure in front of us. Eventually, Hartman and I gathered up the courage and stepped out of our vehicle. When we closed our doors, the sound exploded infinitely outward into the silent marsh. Immediately, we turned on our flashlights, the beams of light being the only haven we felt. We aimed them towards the residence, and immediately something about the house was off. "Morgan, where are the windows?" I felt his words slither down my spine like a frozen snake. He was right. There were no windows. No windows and no cars, only a single massive red door at the entrance. "Let's circle round back and see if we can find something," I suggested, letting my teeth scrape the inside of my cheek again. Every fiber of my being wanted to call in backup, but there was no way in hell I'd risk waiting. Everyone, especially cops, have this danger sense that goes off in bad scenarios. That sense was buzzing hard. The rain began to fall harder, drenching us in thick, humid water. Hartman volunteered to look out back behind the house for any other windows or doors. He came up empty-handed. "No sounds or signs of life," he said quietly, barely audible above the rain. "As bad feelings go, this place is the mother lode." I nodded in response before radioing into the desk. This is when shit gets weird. If you try and use a radio that's out of range, it beeps loudly and won't let you make the transmission. That didn't happen. Our words went through, but we got no reply. Well, no real reply anyway. In response to us, we heard the constant sound of static come over the radios, signifying that something was blocking us out, keying the transmissions from everywhere but that source. We tried to go to our secondary means of communications, our phones. They were, of course, out of service. I wanted to hop back inside our patrol vehicle and wait for backup, but that could take upwards of an hour or more without us radioing it in. Besides, someone made a call to us. Someone was inside that bricked-up building, and we needed to at least knock and see if they were okay. So me and Hartman agreed to at least walk up to that door and see if anyone inside would answer it. We crept towards the door, stepping on the wooden and dilapidated stairs of the porch on our way up. I knocked on the wood, trying to be louder than the thunder that began to sound in the skies above us. Hartman clutched his sidearm. No response. I knocked again. We waited. 10 seconds went by. Nothing. 10 more. Silence. I was on my last 10-second count when we heard the gunshot. One loud pop echoed just barely through the thick wooden door. Police procedure for an active shooter involves rushing inside, heading straight to the threat, and neutralizing it. That's what we tried to do. I put my hand around the metallic door handle and twisted, pistol drawn. Hartman followed right beside me as we charged into the darkness inside that was waiting for us. I can't describe the smell that hit us adequately enough. It was musty and thick. The air smelled of fluids that either belonged inside of someone's body or inside of a bedroom, not displayed openly in the foyer. As soon as both of our feet hit the wooden floors of the interior, the door behind us slammed shut. "Shit, check the door. I'll keep eyes on in the house," I growled. I saw Hartman's flashlight whip back towards the door as mine remained forward and steadfast. We were in some sort of mudroom that led to the foyer. I heard him fiddle with the doorknob and try to shoulder check it open, but I could tell it wasn't budging. This door's spring locked, and hell, it looks like it's got a magnetic strip on the top and bottom. I swallowed hard. Our voices washed through that home like a tidal wave. If this was a trap, whoever was inside knew exactly where we were. We stood in silence for a while. I think we were both expecting a grand reveal. A few shots fired in our direction. Some psycho on psychotics running towards us. But we got none of that. We stood in near total silence. The only other sound besides our shallow breathing was the sound of dripping coming from the main room in front of us. There was also a strange red dust that seemed to float endlessly in the air. "Hello," I called out, directing my voice towards the sounds of the dripping. "Is anyone in there?" The sound of a chair being dragged above us answered my voice. I felt my body tense up. "Someone must be on the second floor," I mumbled towards Hartman. He now stood by my side. With his company, I felt strong enough to venture forward into the foyer. The dripping got louder. As soon as we passed through the entryway, we saw what made the dripping noise. An older man sat in a chair facing us, head tilted to one side. His glazed-over eyes were the first to greet us. The second was the pistol laying on the floor next to him. The dripping came from the blood that slowly trickled down his face, careening itself over the edge of his nose and onto the hardwood floor below him. It seemed like he had killed himself. "Charles?" I heard Hartman repeat to himself. "This isn't Charles, this is Mr. Woodshaw." I looked back to the body. Mr. Woodshaw was a local multimillionaire who disappeared nearly 30 years ago. His family had founded our town. Sure enough, the body looked just like him. "What do we do?" Hartman whispered to me, before pausing and adding in, "And what's in his hand?" A note was crumpled up in his palm. I knew I shouldn't touch it. I knew this could be a crime scene. But I was scared. I wanted answers. So Hartman and I approached the old man's body and took it from his lifeless hands. "Press the button on the stairs." That's all it read. As soon as the last word rattled off inside of my brain, I heard the sound of something being dragged above us, towards the stairs the note had mentioned. I dropped the paper and pulled my pistol and flashlight up to the top of the stairs. I swear, I saw a pale, thin hand point towards the bottom step before retracting itself around the corner and disappearing. "We need to find a way out of here," Hartman said. I wanted to ask him if he had seen what I did, but I didn't want to feed into whatever paranoia was consuming me. Instead, I walked over to the bottom step and felt around. Sure enough, just under the lip of the stair was what felt like a button. I clicked it. "Welcome to the Frederickson Manor, your new paradise." The cheery voice of a younger Mr. Woodshaw echoed out through the main room from the walls. "I apologize I can't be there to greet you in person. I have business to attend to. Feel free to enjoy each other's company while I'm gone. I'll see you shortly." The audio seemed out of place in this barren home. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened here. Immediately after the audio in the speakers spun forward, clearly to a new recording, an older and more distraught Mr. Woodshaw spoke up. "Are you still watching? I can feel it in the air. Am I part of your experiment now? For the first time in 30 years, I can think clearly and I want out." There was a brief pause as Mr. Woodshaw cried to himself. "The front door can be opened with a switch in my office upstairs. I need you to click it. I've done enough." A static came over the speakers as it cut out. "Should we go?" Hartman asked, looking towards the stairs. "I don't see why not. We need to get out of here." Hartman walked up to me, and we both slowly crept up the steps. I heard the sounds of footsteps scattering below us like rats. Neither of us had the courage to look back at what had made the noise. The top of the stairs presented a hallway that we pressed through. We passed by several unassuming doorways, some open and some closed. We were only focused on one. At the end of hallway lay a thick metal door painted the same red as the entrance. We were willing to take the gamble and say that was his office. My eyes eventually traveled to the floor we were walking on. The light from my flashlight illuminated the stains of various liquids on the hardwood floors. In several patches, reddish and alien-looking mold started cracking through the wooden boards. "How long did Mr. Woodshaw live here?" Hartman whispered towards me. "Too long, I'd guess," I replied. We managed to close the distance to the door. I could have sworn at multiple points in the darkness of the open doorways, I saw outlines of things, shadows of people, watching us. This was no longer a job Hartman and I could do alone. We needed to get out and get back up. We reached the metallic door and pressed it open. Inside was a den. This was the only place in the entire home that wasn't layered in red dust and stained with fluids. Old TV monitors had lined the walls along with stacks of notes inside of bookcases. Every TV was on but radiated darkness except for one, the one that showed us with our flashlights entering Mr. Woodshaw's office. He was monitoring every room in this house from here. "Come on, let's look for that switch," Hartman mumbled as he pushed past me. Even though he had claimed to have wanted to find the switch, the first place he searched was the stacks of notes on Mr. Woodshaw's desk. Hardly a help. I ignored my own curiosity and began scrounging the walls and TVs for anything that could be flipped. I ended up finding a whole switchboard dedicated to turning on and off the lights in any given room. I flipped one on and saw something I wish I never did. There was a small storage room filled with the bodies of infants. Some bones, some decaying, but none fresh. I suppose that was some sort of respite. I quickly flicked the light switch back off before doing a double take. I thought I had briefly noticed that someone was standing in the corner of that room. I flicked the light back on, and sure enough, there she was. I don't know if calling her a person would be respectful to the rest of us or not. I know how that sounds, but a person has something to them, something more. This thing, pale as pale can be, just stood there, staring at the dead children. Her face seemed pleased in a strange way. Pleasured. It was when I noticed her hand placement over her groin that I flipped the light back off. Who the fuck could do that to dead children? I flipped another switch and saw a bedroom. A dead woman lay naked and abused on a bed as several men stood next to her, faces staring into the camera and genitals fully exposed. Their faces were contorted in a feral grin, the sides of their mouths crumbling from dehydration. I flipped the light off and tried one more room, a chapel. Inside was a full congregation of people. All were silent and still as the grave, just like all the others. They sat in pews and stared forward at the podium. The red dust flowed free in this room, obscuring almost every detail. I tried hard to see the images painted on the walls, but couldn't make out what they meant. "Jesus," I heard Hartman mumble, breaking my gaze. He had placed his hand over his mouth in disgust. I looked back to the screen to see the whole congregation now standing on their feet. Their heads were twisted towards the camera in disgusted snarls. Before I could process what was happening, they began to sprint out of the room. From the hall outside, I heard the sounds of doors being slammed open and footsteps clamoring towards our direction. I heard the sounds of dozens of feet sprinting towards us. I ran to the door and braced it shut. I looked for a lock, but instead I noticed a magnetic strip above my head. "Hartman, is there a way to lock this door?" I yelled as a thud hit the other side of the metal behind me. Hartman looked up from the notes and saw me plastered against the door. He quickly understood what was happening. He scrounged the desk for a switch as another body slammed against the metal, pushing me forward. "Hurry!" I screamed, my voice shaking. I got it. Hartman shouted from under the desk. I felt the door slam and seal behind me. I took several deep breaths and fell to my knees. "What was that?" he asked. I shook my head in dismissal and pointed to the TV monitors. Hartman rushed over and flipped on the hallway light. With a quick gasp, he flipped the light back off. "What the hell are those things?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Morgan, some of those things shouldn't be moving." I said, "I don't know." I felt my voice rise in anger. Then there was a silence. Even the other side of the door was just as quiet as it had been when we entered. "I'm going to read more. Maybe it'll tell us something. I could use your help." He tossed me some files off of Mr. Woodshaw's desk and continued reading. I flipped through the notes. I don't know how to explain what I read. This place, this home, it was never meant to be a real home. Woodshaw built it to experiment with people. He called it the Pleasure House. He invited people from all over the country for a week's visit, fed them a feast every night, gave them whatever they wanted, provided the most extreme entertainment, including murder, and dealt with whatever responsibility that popped up for the guests. These people were free to leave whenever they wanted. They never did. They became addicted to this lifestyle. All fun, no responsibility. The most disturbing activity was what they did when they became pregnant. They'd give birth and toss the baby into a room to die. That doesn't even get into all the rapes and murders that happened here. Hell, even the servants who brought the food every day fell into the madness and joined in. Without food being brought in, these things ended up eating each other, living in darkness and becoming feral. It was at this point Woodshaw locked them up. For 30 years they've lived here. Some of these people are generations down from the original guests of this house. God only knows how they survived. There was also a mention of some sort of drug that they filtered in through the air ducts. Who they are we never found out. Some sort of affiliate of Woodshaw's that were interested in this experiment themselves, we'd guess. Now, if the guest choices were due to the extreme freedoms, without responsibilities, or from the drug in the air, I couldn't say. But these things, they weren't like us anymore. That much I knew. For the next half hour, Hartman flipped through notes with me. He continued to seem more and more distant with every page. Finally, he just slammed the stack of papers in his hand down and reached under the seat of Mr. Woodshaw's chair. I heard a switch flip. I heard the sounds of pattering footsteps running off down the hall from behind the metallic door. For 30 minutes, those things stood in darkness, not making a sound while waiting for us. I couldn't imagine what would have happened if we'd opened the door sooner. "What did you do?" I asked him. "I opened the front door," he said, his tone emotionless. "We can leave." "But what about those things?" I asked. Hartman's features were frozen. "They left." It took some coaching, but eventually Hartman talked me into leaving. We walked through the empty halls once again. This time, no shadows moved in the darkness. Mr. Woodshaw's body was gone. I'm not sure if those things took him or if he was never dead. I tried not thinking about it. The storm outside had passed, leaving the swamp's water risen. The thin road now would barely be able to fit our patrol vehicle, but we made do. As soon as we made it some distance away, our radios began to work again. We called in for the casualties at the house, and dispatch told us to go back to the scene. We declined. They weren't too happy. What haunts me about this is that there was only one road leading away from that house, yet we didn't even see one of those things on the path. The only other way across was the swamp, and imagining them lurking off the side of the road as we drove past gives me chills. To be honest, the main reason I'm bringing this up is the fact that crime is rising in our town, and not the normal stuff either, but hard stuff, rapes and murder. Not one victim that managed to survive knows who the attackers were, just that they grinned the whole time and looked like they had never seen sunlight. I'm worried that Hartman and I are the reason these people are getting hurt. The federal lawmen are becoming increasingly interested in our town, and before they make us local guys shut up, I wanted to release what I knew.